Abandoned dog appears when a baby is drowning, and his actions surprise everyone. Claire adjusted the straps of her son Liam's stroller as she walked along the narrow sidewalk of their quiet neighborhood. It was a brisk autumn morning, and the chill in the air carried the faint scent of rain. Liam, barely a year old, was bundled in a thick blue blanket, his tiny fingers clutching a plastic teething ring. For Claire, the daily walk was a small escape from the stresses of single motherhood. She worked long shifts as a waitress, juggling bills and childcare with a precision born of necessity. Her days were a whirlwind, but these moments with Liam, watching the world together, were her sanctuary. Today, however, felt different. As she turned the corner toward the park, she noticed something unusual: a dog. The dog was sitting by a lamppost near the park's entrance, its golden brown coat streaked with mud and its frame painfully thin. It watched her with curious, amber eyes, its head tilted slightly to one side. "Poor thing," Claire murmured, slowing her steps. Liam let out a squeal of excitement, flailing his arms as if reaching for the animal. Claire smiled despite herself. "You like him, huh?" she said, brushing a hand over her son's wispy blonde hair. The dog stood as they approached, its movements cautious but not aggressive. Its tail wagged tentatively, and for a moment, Claire considered stopping. But then she noticed its condition: the visible ribs, the limp in its hind leg, and unease prickled at her. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in the area, and while most were harmless, Claire couldn't take chances with Liam. "Come on, buddy," she said, steering the stroller past the animal. The dog watched them go, its tail falling still. As they entered the park, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The playground was nearly empty, save for a few other parents and their children. Autumn leaves scattered across the grass, crunching underfoot as she parked the stroller near a bench. Liam babbled happily, his teething ring clutched tightly as he kicked his legs. Claire took a seat, her eyes scanning the area. The dog had followed them. It stood at the edge of the park, its gaze fixed on Liam. Claire's heart quickened. She told herself it was just a stray looking for food or warmth, but the intensity of its stare unsettled her. "Shoo," she called, waving a hand. The dog didn't move. Amanda arrived a few minutes later, her toddler in tow. She waved cheerfully, but her expression shifted when she noticed Claire's tense demeanor. "What's wrong?" Amanda asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Claire gestured subtly toward the dog. "It's been following us since we left the house." Amanda squinted at the animal, then shrugged. "It's just a stray. Probably hungry. You could throw it something to eat." "I don't want to encourage it," Claire replied, glancing at Liam, who was now giggling at the sight of the dog. Amanda sighed, pulling a granola bar from her bag. "Here, watch this." She unwrapped the snack and tossed a piece toward the dog. The animal hesitated before inching closer, sniffing the ground cautiously. It devoured the food in seconds, then looked back at Liam with its tail wagging. "See?" Amanda said with a grin. "Harmless." Claire wasn't convinced. As the morning wore on, Claire tried to relax. She pushed Liam on the baby swing, his laughter echoing through the park. For a while, the dog stayed at a distance, lying in the shade of a tree. But when Claire turned her back for just a moment, the situation changed. Liam had wriggled free of his stroller, crawling toward the edge of a shallow pond at the center of the park. "Liam!" Claire shouted, dropping her phone as she ran toward him. The dog was faster. Before Claire could reach the water, the animal darted past her, barking furiously. It stopped just as Liam reached the edge, positioning itself between the baby and the water. Liam giggled, oblivious to the danger. The dog nudged him back gently with its nose, its body tense as if guarding him from the pond. Claire's relief was immediate but short-lived. She scooped Liam into her arms, her heart pounding. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, more to herself than to her son. The dog stood a few feet away, its tail wagging slowly as it watched her. For the first time, Claire noticed something around its neck, a collar. It was old and frayed, the leather cracked and faded. A small metal tag dangled from it, but the inscription was too worn to read from a distance. "Who do you belong to?" Claire murmured, her voice softer now. The dog tilted its head, as if considering the question. By the time Claire and Liam left the park, the dog was gone. Or so she thought. As she approached her house, she spotted it again, sitting on the sidewalk a few yards away. It didn't follow them inside, but its presence lingered in her mind long after she had locked the door. That night, as Liam slept peacefully in his crib, Claire stared out the window. The dog was still there, curled up under a street lamp. Something about it tugged at her, a strange mix of unease and curiosity. She couldn't explain it, but she had a feeling their paths would cross again. The following morning dawned overcast, with gray clouds stretching across the sky. Claire peered out the window, half expecting to see the dog still curled under the street lamp. To her surprise, the sidewalk was empty. Liam sat in his highchair, babbling between spoonfuls of mashed banana. His carefree demeanor was a stark contrast to the unease lingering in Claire's chest. "Ready for another day, buddy?" she asked, ruffling his hair. Liam responded with a happy squeal, smacking his tiny hands on the tray. Claire decided to take him to the park again. Despite the strange events of the previous day, the fresh air and open space were good for both of them. The park was busier than usual, with families scattered across the playground and joggers circling the paths. Claire parked the stroller near their usual bench and lifted Liam out. "Let's stay away from the pond today, okay?" she said, placing him on the grass with his favorite toys. She scanned the area, her gaze lingering on the spot where the dog had appeared before. There was no sign of it now, and she felt a flicker of relief. Amanda arrived shortly after, her toddler trailing behind her. "Hey, any sign of your little stalker?" she teased, sitting beside Claire. "No, thank God," Claire replied, though her voice held a note of doubt. "Maybe it finally wandered off." Amanda shrugged. "Probably. Strays don't stick around long unless someone feeds them." As the morning progressed, Claire began to relax. She chatted with Amanda, keeping a watchful eye on Liam as he crawled through the grass. The toddlers laughed and played, their joy infectious. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Claire saw movement. Near the tree line, partially obscured by shadows, the dog stood watching. Its amber eyes met hers, and her stomach tightened. "It's back," she whispered, nudging Amanda. Amanda followed her gaze and frowned. "It really likes you guys, huh?" Claire stood, scooping Liam into her arms. "This isn't normal. Why won't it leave us alone?" The dog stepped forward, its posture low and non-threatening. It didn't bark or growl, it simply watched as if waiting for something. "Claire, I don't think it's dangerous," Amanda said cautiously. "Maybe not, but I can't take any chances," Claire replied, her voice firm. She began packing up their things, but before she could secure Liam in the stroller, he wriggled free, giggling as he toddled toward the dog. "Liam, no!" Claire shouted, panic rising in her chest. Liam stumbled, his little feet carrying him closer to the edge of the pond. Time seemed to slow as Claire dropped everything and ran after him. The dog reacted first. With a burst of speed, it sprinted past Claire, its paws kicking up dirt as it reached Liam just as the child's foot slipped on the muddy bank. Claire watched in horror as Liam tumbled forward, splashing into the shallow water. "No!" she screamed, her legs propelling her faster. The dog leapt into the pond without hesitation. Its strong jaws gently clamped onto the back of Liam's shirt, and it paddled toward the shore with surprising strength. Claire reached the edge just as the dog pulled Liam onto the grass. She dropped to her knees, scooping her son into her arms. "Liam! Are you okay?" she sobbed, her hands frantically checking him for injuries. Liam coughed and cried but appeared unharmed. Claire clutched him tightly, tears streaming down her face. The dog stood nearby, its fur soaked and matted. It shook off the water, droplets scattering like rain. For a moment, it simply watched Claire, its amber eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Then it collapsed. "Claire," Amanda said, rushing over. "Is Liam?" She stopped short, her eyes widening at the sight of the dog. "He's okay," Claire said shakily, holding Liam close. "But the dog?" Amanda knelt beside the animal, her hand hovering uncertainly over its drenched coat. "It's hurt. Probably exhausted from whatever it's been through." Claire hesitated, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude and fear. "We need to do something," she said finally. With Amanda's help, Claire bundled Liam into the stroller and carefully lifted the dog into the basket beneath it. It was a tight fit, but the animal didn't resist. They made their way to the nearest veterinary clinic, a small building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The receptionist looked startled as Claire and Amanda burst in, explaining the situation in hurried tones. The veterinarian, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Harper, emerged moments later. She examined the dog with practiced hands, her expression growing somber. "This dog has been through a lot," Dr. Harper said. "It's malnourished and has several old injuries. I'll need to run tests to see if there's anything more serious going on." Claire waited anxiously in the clinic's lobby, Liam asleep in her arms. Amanda had left to pick up her toddler, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. She replayed the events at the park, her heart aching at the memory of Liam's fall. If the dog hadn't been there. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Dr. Harper returned with an update. "The good news is that most of the injuries are treatable. But this dog is in rough shape. It'll need surgery to fix its leg, and the costs won't be cheap." Claire's stomach sank. She barely made ends meet as it was. "Can you hold on to him for a little while?" she asked. Dr. Harper nodded. "We can keep him here for a few days, but after that, he'll need a home, or a rescue willing to take him." Claire looked down at Liam, who was now snuggling against her chest. The dog had saved her son's life. Could she really walk away from it now? As Claire left the clinic, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on her. The dog's loyalty and courage had been undeniable, but the practicalities of keeping it felt overwhelming. Yet, as she walked home with Liam, she couldn't shake the image of those amber eyes, filled with strength, intelligence, and something that felt almost like trust. "This isn't over," she murmured, her resolve hardening. The sound of Liam's soft laughter filled the living room as Claire folded a pile of laundry. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting warm patches of light on the carpet where Liam sat, stacking colorful blocks. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. But the memory of the dog, its wet, trembling body and those piercing amber eyes, lingered in Claire's mind. She had spent the night agonizing over what to do. The dog had saved Liam's life, yet she couldn't ignore the financial and logistical challenges of keeping it. Her already stretched budget couldn't handle the cost of surgery, let alone food and care. Still, the idea of leaving the dog to its fate felt wrong. That afternoon, Claire returned to the veterinary clinic. Dr. Harper greeted her with a sympathetic smile. "How's he doing?" Claire asked, glancing toward the back room where the dog was being kept. "He's stable," Dr. Harper replied. "But we can't delay the surgery for long. Have you thought about what you want to do?" Claire hesitated, her hands gripping the strap of her purse. "I want to help him. But I don't know how I'm going to afford it." Dr. Harper nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There are ways we can try to offset the costs. Some local organizations might pitch in if you're willing to share his story." "His story?" Claire repeated, confused. Dr. Harper smiled. "A dog that saves a baby? That's the kind of thing people want to help with. You'd be surprised how generous they can be." That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She had spent the last hour drafting and deleting posts for an online fundraising campaign. "What do I even say?" she muttered to herself, glancing at Liam, who was fast asleep in his crib. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, "You've got to share what happened. People will want to help. Trust me." With a deep breath, Claire began typing. "A stray dog saved my son's life yesterday. Now he needs our help to survive." She included a photo of the dog, taken by Dr. Harper, and a short description of the incident. Before she could second-guess herself, she clicked Post. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared dozens of times, and messages of support flooded her inbox. "What a brave dog," one commenter wrote. "Let me know where to donate," said another. By the next morning, Claire's fundraising page had reached nearly half its goal. Amanda called her, breathless with excitement. "I told you this would work," Amanda said. "You've got a whole community behind you now." Claire felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could save the dog that had saved Liam. While waiting for the donations to accumulate, Claire found herself drawn to the mysterious collar the dog had been wearing. It was old and weathered, but a faint engraving was still visible on the metal tag. #A4736, call for return. The numbers didn't make sense to her, but they felt important. Acting on a hunch, she took a photo of the tag and emailed it to a local animal shelter, asking if they could trace it. The next day, she received a reply. "This tag matches a dog registered to a man named Henry Carter. He lived in the area but hasn't been heard from in years. We're looking into it." Curiosity gnawed at Claire. Who was Henry Carter? And what had happened to him? That evening, she searched his name online. Articles popped up, detailing a local man who had gone missing 2 years earlier during a hiking trip. He had been presumed dead, though his body was never found. One article mentioned that Henry had owned a golden retriever mix named Shadow. Shadow, Claire murmured, the name feeling right somehow. She stared at the photo attached to the article, a younger version of the same dog now recovering at the clinic. The revelation sent Claire's mind racing. How had Shadow survived for so long? And why had he ended up here, in her small neighborhood? She shared her discovery with Dr. Harper during her next visit to the clinic. The vet listened intently, her brow furrowed. "It's incredible that he's still alive," Dr. Harper said. "But it also explains a lot, his condition, his resilience. He's been through so much." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a survivor, like her. "We'll figure this out," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The day of Shadow's surgery arrived sooner than Claire expected. Thanks to the fundraising campaign, they had raised enough to cover the costs. Claire arrived at the clinic early, her heart pounding as she handed over the final payment. Dr. Harper assured her that Shadow was in good hands, but the wait was agonizing. Claire paced the lobby, clutching Liam close as the minutes dragged into hours. Amanda joined her halfway through, offering coffee and words of encouragement. "He's going to be fine," Amanda said. "That dog is a fighter." Claire nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. Finally, Dr. Harper emerged from the operating room, her expression tired but relieved. "The surgery went well," she said. "Shadow's out of the woods, but he'll need time to recover." Claire felt a wave of relief so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. She was allowed to see Shadow briefly. The dog lay on a cushioned bed, his breathing steady but shallow. His amber eyes opened slightly when Claire approached, and his tail thumped weakly against the blanket. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, crouching beside him. "We've got you now." That night, Claire updated the fundraiser page, sharing the good news with everyone who had contributed. Messages of congratulations and relief poured in, but one comment stood out. If Shadow's previous owner was Henry Carter, what happened to him? Someone should find out. The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She realized that while Shadow's immediate future was secure, his past still held unanswered questions, and those questions might lead to even greater truths. The buzz around Shadow's story continued to grow in the days following his surgery. Claire's fundraiser page had surpassed its goal, with additional donations pouring in from people inspired by the dog's bravery. "Everyone loves a hero," Amanda said, scrolling through the comments on her phone during their afternoon coffee break. "And Shadow's the perfect one." Claire smiled faintly but felt a tug of responsibility. Shadow had saved her son, but his story was still incomplete. The name Henry Carter lingered in her thoughts, a mystery that refused to let go. Determined to do more for Shadow and the growing attention his story was receiving, Claire decided to organize a small event at the park. The idea was simple: celebrate Shadow's recovery while raising awareness about stray animals and rescues. She reached out to local shelters, small businesses, and neighbors, pitching the idea. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. "This could be big," Amanda said as they worked on flyers at Claire's kitchen table. "People love feel-good stories, and Shadow's practically a local celebrity now." Claire nodded, glancing at Liam, who was playing with a stuffed animal. "I just want to do right by him. He's done so much for us." The event came together faster than Claire expected. On the day of the celebration, the park was bustling with activity. Vendors set up booths selling pet supplies and baked goods, while volunteers from local shelters showcased animals available for adoption. Claire stood by the main booth, holding Liam on her hip. Shadow lay at her feet, his coat shinier and his eyes brighter after days of recovery. A red bandana around his neck marked him as the guest of honor. People flocked to meet him, offering treats and gentle pets. Shadow wagged his tail politely but kept his gaze mostly on Claire and Liam, as if still guarding them. As the event unfolded, Claire noticed a man standing near the edge of the crowd, his expression pensive. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered jacket that looked like it had seen too many winters. Something about him felt familiar, though Claire couldn't place why. When their eyes met, he hesitated before approaching her. "Are you Claire?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. "Yes," she said, shifting Liam slightly. "Can I help you?" The man glanced at Shadow, who perked up immediately, his tail wagging. "I think that dog belongs to someone I used to know," he said softly. The man introduced himself as Thomas, a retired park ranger who had worked in the area for decades. He explained that he had been close friends with Henry Carter before his disappearance. "Henry and Shadow were inseparable," Thomas said, crouching to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I was with Henry the day he disappeared. We were hiking, and there was a rock slide. I thought they both," he trailed off, his voice heavy with emotion. Claire felt a chill run through her. "But Shadow survived," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded. "I don't know how he made it. But if he's here now, it means Henry might have tried to send a message." Thomas pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket, handing it to Claire. "This was mailed to me a week after the accident. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Claire opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a short note written in shaky handwriting. "Shadow knows the way. Trust him." Her hands trembled as she read the words. "What does this mean?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. But if Shadow's here, it's for a reason." The revelation deepened the mystery surrounding Shadow and his connection to Henry. That evening, after the event had wound down, Claire sat on her couch with Amanda, poring over maps of the area where Henry had disappeared. "There's a trail that runs through those woods," Thomas had said earlier. "It's dangerous, but if Shadow came back from there, maybe he can lead you to something." Claire looked down at the dog, who lay curled up at her feet. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she felt a sense of purpose beyond gratitude. "I think he's trying to tell us something," she said. The following morning, Claire packed a small bag with essentials, water, snacks for Liam, and a sturdy leash for Shadow. Amanda insisted on coming along, and Thomas offered to guide them partway. The group set out early, following the trail that Thomas had marked on the map. The path was rugged and overgrown, with fallen branches and rocks making the journey slow. Shadow led the way, his nose to the ground and his movements purposeful. "He's amazing," Amanda said, watching as the dog navigated the trail with ease. "It's like he knows exactly where he's going." Claire nodded, though her heart pounded with anticipation. As the trail climbed higher into the hills, the trees thinned, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. Claire paused to catch her breath, glancing back at Liam, who was strapped securely to her chest in a carrier. "We're close," Thomas said, his voice steady. Shadow barked, pulling gently on his leash. Claire followed him, her pulse quickening as they rounded a bend in the trail. What they found stopped her in her tracks. A small clearing lay ahead, marked by the remnants of a campsite. A tattered tent leaned precariously against a tree, its fabric faded and torn. Nearby, a pile of stones had been arranged into what looked like a makeshift memorial. Shadow ran to the stones, his tail wagging furiously. He pawed at the ground, barking excitedly. Thomas knelt beside the memorial, his expression unreadable. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. Claire stepped closer, her heart heavy. Among the stones was a rusted compass with the initials HC engraved on the side. "He left this here," Thomas said, holding the compass. "It's his." The group spent hours combing through the area, piecing together what little they could. Though there was no definitive answer to what had happened to Henry, the discovery of his campsite brought a sense of closure to Thomas, and to Shadow. As they made their way back down the trail, Claire felt a newfound respect for the dog walking beside her. Shadow wasn't just a survivor, he was a messenger, carrying the legacy of a man who had loved him deeply. Back in town, the story of the hike spread quickly. The fundraiser page transformed into a space for people to share their own tales of loyalty and courage, inspired by Shadow's journey. For Claire, the experience had been life-changing. She had started out as a cautious, overwhelmed mother, but now she felt connected to something bigger, a community united by compassion and resilience. And at the center of it all was Shadow, the dog who had brought them together. The days following their trek into the hills passed in a blur. Claire couldn't stop thinking about the campsite, the compass, and Shadow's unshakable loyalty. The dog had returned to the place where Henry Carter had left his mark, and now, Claire felt an obligation to honor that connection. But questions still lingered. Why had Henry disappeared? And why had Shadow ended up at the park, as if searching for something, or someone? That morning, Claire sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. Liam played on the floor with a plastic truck, while Shadow rested nearby, his head on his paws. The doorbell rang, startling her out of her thoughts. Standing on the porch was Thomas, clutching a worn leather journal. "I found this among Henry's things after he went missing," Thomas said, handing it to Claire. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but after what we found in the hills, I thought you should see it." Claire opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with sketches of the trails, notes about weather patterns, and, near the end, personal reflections. One entry caught her eye. "If anything happens to me, Shadow knows the way. He'll protect what matters most. Trust him." Claire's throat tightened. What did he mean by, "what matters most"? Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. But Henry was always a man of his word." The journal entry reignited Claire's determination. With Thomas's help, she began piecing together the fragments of Henry's story. They revisited the fundraiser page, where someone had commented about seeing Henry on the trail just days before his disappearance. Claire reached out to the commenter, a woman named Elaine, who agreed to meet them at the park. Elaine described a chance encounter with Henry and Shadow while hiking. He seemed preoccupied, she said. Kept mentioning something about unfinished business. But he never explained what it was. The words added to the mystery, but they also brought Claire closer to an answer. That evening, as Claire tucked Liam into bed, her thoughts were a whirlwind. Shadow lay by the crib, his steady presence a source of comfort. She crouched beside him, running her hand through his fur. What did Henry mean? She whispered. Why did he trust you to find us? Shadow blinked up at her, his amber eyes calm and knowing. The next day, Claire returned to the veterinary clinic to speak with Dr. Harper. She shared the latest revelations, including the journal and Elaine's story. Dr. Harper listened intently, then said, "You've already done so much for Shadow. Maybe it's time to focus on what he needs now, a family, stability." Claire nodded, but deep down, she felt there was more to discover. Later that afternoon, she received an unexpected call from a local historian who had read about Shadow's story online. The man claimed to have information about Henry's family and invited Claire to meet him. The meeting was brief but revealing. The historian explained that Henry had spent years researching his family's history, particularly a plot of land deep in the hills where they had once lived. It was important to him, the historian said. He believed that place held the key to something significant, something worth preserving. Claire felt a pang of recognition. That must be where we found the campsite, she said. The historian nodded. It's likely. Whatever Henry left behind, Shadow was his way of ensuring it wouldn't be forgotten. Armed with this new perspective, Claire decided to revisit the hills one last time. She packed supplies, secured Liam in his carrier, and leashed Shadow. Amanda and Thomas joined her, their determination mirroring her own. As they retraced their steps, Shadow's energy was palpable. He moved with purpose, his tail wagging as he led them higher into the hills. When they reached the clearing, Shadow began sniffing the ground near the memorial stones. He pawed at the earth, barking excitedly. Thomas knelt beside the dog, his hands brushing away dirt to reveal a small wooden box buried beneath the stones. Inside were photographs, letters, and a map, artifacts of Henry's life and his connection to the land. One photo showed Henry as a boy, standing with his family in front of a cabin that had long since disappeared. This is what he wanted to protect, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Claire leafed through the letters, many addressed to Henry's siblings and parents. They told a story of resilience, loss, and a deep love for the land that had shaped their lives. As they descended the trail, Claire felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Shadow trotted beside her, his head held high, as if proud of what they had accomplished. Back in town, Claire shared the discovery with the community, posting updates and photos online. The response was overwhelming, with people expressing admiration for Henry's dedication and Shadow's role in preserving his legacy. Claire knew she had fulfilled Henry's final wish, and that Shadow had been the key to unlocking it all. That evening, Claire sat on her porch with Shadow by her side. Liam played on the grass, his laughter echoing in the cool evening air. "You've done so much, boy," Claire said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Henry would be proud." Shadow wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. The following weeks brought new opportunities for Claire and her family. Local businesses offered to sponsor Shadow's care, and a documentary crew reached out to tell his story. But for Claire, the greatest reward was the bond she had formed with the dog who had saved her son, and, in many ways, her own sense of purpose. As the stars filled the sky, Claire felt a quiet peace settle over her. Shadow had found his way to her for a reason, and together, they had honored a legacy worth remembering. The buzz surrounding Shadow's story showed no signs of slowing. News outlets picked up the tale of the heroic dog and his connection to a long-lost owner, and the local community rallied around Claire and her family. But for Claire, life had settled into a new kind of normal. Shadow had become an inseparable part of her household, his presence a steady reminder of loyalty and second chances. One morning, Claire stood in her kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee as Liam babbled happily in his highchair. Shadow lay by the sliding glass door, his eyes half closed in the sunlight. A knock at the door interrupted the peaceful moment. Claire opened it to find Amanda holding a stack of mail, her expression excited. "You're famous now," Amanda teased, handing her a thick envelope. "This came for you. Looks important." Claire opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from a legal firm representing Henry Carter's estate. "Dear Ms. Claire Hayes, we were recently made aware of your role in preserving the belongings and memory of Henry Carter. Per his final wishes, the land associated with his family has been entrusted to you and your family, with the understanding that it will be cared for and maintained." Claire's breath caught. "They're giving me his land?" Amanda grinned. "Looks like it." The news felt surreal. Claire spent the afternoon researching the property, discovering that it encompassed several acres of untouched forest and a small, dilapidated cabin near the clearing where they had found Henry's belongings. "Imagine what we could do with it," Amanda said, her voice filled with excitement. But Claire's mind was on something else. The land wasn't just an inheritance, it was a responsibility. She thought of Shadow, of the way he had led them there as if fulfilling a mission. The following weekend, Claire packed up the car and drove to the property with Liam and Shadow. The air was crisp and cool as they walked through the overgrown trails, Shadow leading the way as always. When they reached the clearing, Claire felt a deep sense of connection to the place. It wasn't just land, it was a part of Henry's story, of Shadow's journey, and now of her own. Liam toddled through the grass, his laughter filling the air. Shadow stayed close, his tail wagging as he sniffed the ground. "This is where it all started," Claire said softly, crouching beside Shadow. "And it's where we'll start something new." Over the next few months, Claire poured her energy into restoring the cabin and the surrounding land. With the help of volunteers and local businesses, they cleared debris, repaired the structure, and created a space that honored Henry's memory. The project became a community effort, drawing people from all walks of life who had been touched by Shadow's story. Amanda helped organize events to fund the restoration, and Thomas shared stories of his adventures with Henry, keeping his friend's legacy alive. One sunny afternoon, Claire stood on the porch of the newly restored cabin, watching as a group of children played in the meadow. Liam was among them, his giggles carrying on the breeze. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He had aged noticeably in the months since they first met, but his spirit remained unshaken. "You've done so much, old boy," Claire said, scratching behind his ears. "I hope you know how much you mean to us." Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes soft and full of understanding. As the sun began to set, Claire gathered everyone around the fire pit near the cabin. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, the community coming together to celebrate not just Shadow's journey, but the resilience of those he had brought together. Thomas stood to speak, his voice steady but emotional. Shadow wasn't just Henry's dog, he was a part of his soul. And now, he's a part of all of us. This land, this story, it's something we can all share and protect. Claire felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight. She realized that Shadow had done more than save Liam's life. He had created a bond that would last far beyond this moment. That night, as Claire tucked Liam into bed in the cabin's small but cozy room, she felt a profound sense of peace. She sat on the porch with Shadow, watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky. "This is home now," she said softly, running a hand through his fur. Shadow wagged his tail gently, leaning against her. The following weeks brought more visitors to the cabin, many drawn by Shadow's story and the new sense of purpose it had inspired in the community. Claire began hosting workshops and events, teaching children about nature and the importance of resilience and compassion. Shadow became the centerpiece of it all, his story a reminder of how even the smallest acts of bravery could ripple outward and change lives. On a quiet morning, months later, Claire sat by the fire with Shadow at her feet and Liam playing nearby. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, his body relaxed in a way that spoke of contentment. As she looked into his amber eyes, Claire felt a rush of gratitude, for the life he had saved, for the journey he had led her on, and for the legacy they had built together. "You're our hero, Shadow," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Shadow's tail thumped softly against the floor, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The crisp air of early spring carried the scent of blooming wildflowers as Claire stepped onto the porch of the cabin. The land had transformed over the past year, no longer a forgotten relic of the past but a vibrant space filled with life and purpose. Liam, now a confident toddler, toddled across the meadow with a stick in hand, his laughter echoing through the trees. Shadow followed close behind, his steps slower but steady, his protective gaze never straying far from the boy. Claire smiled, her heart full as she watched them together. The cabin had become more than a home, it was now a hub for the community. Every weekend, families gathered to explore the trails, share stories, and participate in events that celebrated the resilience and courage Shadow represented. A plaque near the cabin's entrance read, "In honor of Henry Carter and Shadow, a testament to love, loyalty, and second chances." Claire often caught visitors pausing to read it, their expressions softening as they took in the story of the dog who had saved her son and changed their lives forever. On the anniversary of Shadow's rescue of Liam, Claire organized a special event. Families, friends, and strangers gathered in the clearing, sharing food and laughter as they reflected on the year's journey. Thomas stood beside Claire, his hand resting on Shadow's head. "He's the heart of all this," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "He brought us together." Claire nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never thought a dog could change my life so completely. But he did, and not just mine." As the sun set, Claire led the group in a moment of silence to honor Henry's memory and the sacrifices he had made. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the past and future. Shadow lay by the fire, his eyes half closed as if soaking in the warmth and love surrounding him. For Claire, this moment felt like the culmination of everything they had been through, a celebration not just of survival, but of the enduring bonds that connected them all. In the weeks that followed, Claire expanded the programs at the cabin. She began hosting workshops on animal care and adoption, using Shadow's story to inspire others to give second chances to creatures in need. Schools sent students on field trips to learn about the land's history, and artists came to sketch the trails and the cabin, their work often featuring Shadow in some form. For Claire, this was the greatest tribute she could offer, to ensure that the lessons Shadow and Henry had taught her continued to ripple outward, touching as many lives as possible. On a quiet morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Claire sat on the porch with a steaming cup of tea. Liam played in the grass, his laughter filling the air. Shadow lay at her feet, his golden coat shining in the soft light. Claire reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You've done so much, Shadow," she said softly. "More than I can ever repay." Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes calm and steady. As the seasons turned, Claire noticed Shadow slowing down. His steps were less sure, his naps longer, but his spirit remained unbroken. The community rallied around him, offering comfort and support in his twilight years. One chilly evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, Shadow lay beside the fire with Claire and Liam close by. Claire felt a deep sense of peace as she stroked his fur, whispering words of love and gratitude. That night, Shadow passed away quietly, surrounded by the family he had chosen. The loss was profound, but Claire found solace in the legacy Shadow had left behind. His story continued to inspire, his memory a guiding light for those who visited the cabin. Claire commissioned a small statue of Shadow to be placed near the clearing, where children and families could gather and remember the dog who had brought them all together. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Shadow, a hero, a guardian, and a friend. Years later, as Liam grew older, he would often ask Claire to tell him Shadow's story. Each time, she would smile and begin. "There once was a dog who came to us when we needed him most." And so, the legacy of Shadow lived on, woven into the hearts of everyone he had touched, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could create ripples that lasted forever.